Hey everyone, we're looking at the endocrine system in this chapter. The endocrine system is a collection of organs that have cells in them that make chemical components that can travel in the blood to go do stuff. A quick survey or overview of these organs are the following. There's the pituitary gland, there's the pineal gland, there is the thyroid gland, the thymus, the adrenal glands, the pancreas, the gonads. Okay, and we'll look at each of these organs, some of the hormones that they make, the things that they do. And before we do any of that, we need to consider the different types of hormones. So hormone, again, anything that can travel in the blood and exert an effect somewhere else in the body other than where it was made. And there's hydrophilic hormones, which are those that are water loving, so they dissolve in water. And then there is the hydrophobic hormones. The hydrophilic ones, these are proteinaceous in their nature, and so they vary in how large they are. Some hormones that are just going to be an amine hormone, and this is only going to be made of a simple amino acid that's been modified in some way. So for example, here you're seeing norepinephrine, which is just a modified amino acid. Okay, it's a very small molecule. You could have a peptide hormone. That's one that has several amino acids linked together. Not a really, really large protein, but it is yet nonetheless a few peptides that are bound together. You could have a protein hormone, which is going to be just a larger protein. So this would be on the order of, these types of hormones here would be on the order of like 50 or less amino acids, probably even less than that, 20 or less. And these would be proteins that are made out of acid chains that are like 100 or 200 or greater. Okay, the steroid hormones are derivatives of cholesterol, and they are hydrophobic. Some of the principal ones here are testosterone and also progesterone are some examples there. And depending on the composition of the hormone, there's going to be different mechanisms of action. So here's a figure that shows the two schemes. On the left, we have a lipid-soluble hormone, which will diffuse out and enter into a cell. Remember, if it's lipid-soluble, it can pass through the fatty acid barrier that is found in the plasma membrane of the cell. If you recall a cell membrane, it's made out of a phospholipid bilayer, which looks something like this. You have these phospholipids, something like that, and like that, and like that, and like that, and like that. Okay, and this is all in the middle here where the fatty acids are. That's all hydrophobic. There's only just a small little hydrophilic head on those phospholipids. So much of it is hydrophobic. So if you have a hydrophobic substance, it can usually pass through the membrane okay. It's able to sneak past the hydrophilic heads. So a lipid-soluble hormone will pass through, and generally what happens is it will bind to something like a receptor hormone complex, and then ultimately it usually travels into the nucleus. It will bind onto the genes and act to either upregulate or downregulate transcription of some gene. So the thing that's going to happen then is that there's going to be more and more transcripts or less transcripts made, and then those will be translated, and then the actual protein will be resulting. So there is a lot of time that has to take place here, because you have to have time for genetic changes like this to occur. There has to be time for transcription to occur. There has to be time for translation to occur. All these different types of things. Okay, in contrast then, a hydrophilic hormone, the way that this one works is that it has to bind to a receptor protein, because it can't just diffuse across the cell membrane. There has to be a door to which or a lock to which it attaches. And so because of that, there's an important difference here between hydrophobic and hydrophilic hormones. The hydrophobic hormones are going to be those that the hydrophobic hormones generally can go into any cell in the body, so they're more of a ubiquitous effect that is experienced, and they affect cells all throughout the entire body, whereas a hydrophilic hormone, this one can only work on a cell that bears the appropriate receptor. So hydrophilic hormones can have very specific target sites. For example, you could have a hormone such as adrenocorticotropin hormone made in the anterior pituitary gland. And then from there, it would travel into the blood and pass by cells that are found all over in the body, but bind only specifically to cells that are found in the cortex of the adrenal gland. So that's its target site. And it only binds to them because only those cells are the ones that would bear the receptor to which it could bind. And furthermore, the mechanism of action here is different. In the hydrophobic hormones, we had genes being turned on and off to upregulate or downregulate expression of those genes. On the hydrophilic side, it's going to be more of a G protein coupled response. So this is a pretty classic response that is a signal transduction pathway in cellular biology, where you have a receptor binding or a ligand or something binding to the receptor. It causes a conformational change. The G protein becomes activated in combination with adenylyl cyclase, forms cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is the second messenger. Here was the first messenger. Here is the second messenger. And then ultimately what usually happens is that there are a variety of proteins that are, or enzymes that are turning off, on and off, which ultimately will either add or take off a phosphate group from a protein. And it's the addition, it's the phosphorylation or dephosphorylation of those proteins which render them either active or not active, or they make them functionally different in some way, and that will have some sort of effect. Okay, this is all a really pretty swift process. This all happens in probably a matter of seconds, okay? Whereas over here, this probably happens more on an order of hours or days. So a little longer lasting on the hydrophobic hormones, but slower to exert their effect, and that's different than the hydrophilic hormones, which bind, and then almost immediately there's a signal transduction that leads to an intracellular cascade of events that ultimately do something. All right, the first set of organs we're going to look at here are the hypothalamus and the pituitary complex. So this is found right on the inferior margins of the diencephalon. Remember, the diencephalon is this part right here in the middle of the brain. And right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will release a lot of what are known as releasing and inhibiting hormones. And the purpose of the hormones that are made in the hypothalamus is that they will travel down to the pituitary gland, and they will cause the release of the hormones that are made there. Okay, so if there needs to be something made, the releasing hormone will be released. It will cause a hormone to be released from either from the anterior pituitary gland, let's say. And if there's an inhibiting hormone released that travels down, then it's going to block that hormone from being released from the pituitary gland. So all that to say, the hypothalamus governs the actions of the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a major homeostasis center for the body, and there's a lot of capillaries that are wrapping around here. This is the hypophyseal portal system. This is a major gateway into which hormones can get into the body and then travel around. It's like the way to escape the blood-brain barrier. The brain is somewhat isolated from the blood. It's somewhat isolated from the cardiovascular system because of the blood-brain barrier. And that exit point out of the blood-brain barrier is sort of here in the pituitary gland. So that makes for a nice place for hormones to be released. Okay, now a little bit of the difference between the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland is more glandular, meaning it has cells in it that make more hormones. The posterior pituitary gland is more nervous tissue. And so the way that it works is that there are releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that are created, and they will travel down through neurons into the anterior pituitary gland, into the anterior glandular cells, and those cells will be then stimulated to make hormones and then secrete them. So there's a variety of hormones made here. There's luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropin, growth hormone, and prolactin. Now, some of these are called tropins. Tropins are any type of, or a tropic hormone is any type of hormone that goes to somewhere else and causes another hormone to be released somewhere else. So, for example, the tropins of the anterior pituitary gland are the ones that you see here: luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropin. Each of these will go somewhere to the body and do something. So luteinizing hormone, what it does is it goes to the cells of the gonads and it causes the production of sex hormones. So whether that be testosterone from the Leydig cells of the testes or estrogens from the fecal and granulosa cells of the ovary. Okay, the follicle stimulating hormone is the one that's going to go also to the gonads and then cause an array of things to be released that lead to maturation of the gametes. This happens differently in male and female reproductive anatomy, but same outcome: proliferation and production and maturation of the gametes. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone, this is traveling to the thyroid gland, and it's going to cause the thyroid gland to release additional hormones. And then adrenocorticotropin is going to be the one that goes to the cortex of the adrenal gland and stimulates the release of additional hormones. Growth hormone and prolactin then are two that are not tropins that are made in the anterior pituitary gland. Growth hormone, as the name suggests, this will travel to a lot of the various tissues in the body and plays a role in proliferation of bone and also muscle mass. And so, for example, during puberty, there's a lot more growth hormone that's released, which is going to drive the acceleration in bone mass and muscle mass during those times. Prolactin is going to go to the mammary glands, and it is going to prepare them for creating milk. A woman who's not breastfeeding, her breast tissue is mostly just adipose tissue. However, in pregnancy, then prolactin is made, which goes and causes the proliferation of mammary glands to form in the breast tissue. They will start creating milk, and then the breast tissue will enlarge because now there's all these glands and milk being produced there. So that's prolactin. That's the role there. Okay, on the posterior pituitary gland, this is a little bit different because the cells here are not glandular. The cells here are more nervous in nature. And so how this works is the hormone's actually made in the hypothalamus. So there's two hormones that are released. There's oxytocin and there's antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin is made way up here in the supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus. And so it was made there, and it will travel down the axon through to the portal system, or the capillary plexus here, surrounding the posterior pituitary gland. And then they will be released into the blood. So even though oxytocin is released from the terminals of neurons in the posterior pituitary gland, it's not actually made there. It's just the place that it's released. And that is also true of antidiuretic hormone. Okay, and there's one other one that is made in the pars intermedia, the place in between the two, the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland, and that is melanocyte stimulating hormone, and it's going to go to the melanocytes and cause them to produce and release melanin, the pigment that gives your skin its darker color and helps you to be shielded from UV. All right, moving right along then, the thyroid gland is going to sit just underneath the thyroid cartilage. So this is your larynx here. You've got the thyroid cartilage. This is the Adam's apple. Your thyroid gland is going to sit right underneath it. And the thyroid gland makes a couple of hormones. It's going to make the thyroxine hormone, so T3 and T4. Both of these are going to regulate your metabolism. So these have more of a widespread target site. When they're released, they go to a lot of different cells in the body, either and turn them up, so to speak. They start creating more energy, and they become more active, and that's going to drive your metabolism. There's another hormone made that is called calcitonin. And calcitonin, what its job is it raises, sorry, that's incorrect, it lowers an elevated blood calcium level. Lowers an elevated blood calcium level. Okay. Now, one application of this is a goiter. There is iodine that is required to make T3 and T4, and we'll see that mechanism here in the next couple of slides. But if there's not enough iodine in the diet, what's going to happen is there's going to be less T3 and T4 made because they require iodine. So then you'll have thyroid stimulating hormone continually acting on the thyroid gland, telling it to, make T3 and T4, but T3 and T4 are not made. And so all of that thyroid stimulating hormone activity causes the tissues to swell because they're being told to be ever more active, and the tissue begins to enlarge, and it can become so large that it looks like a goiter, which, let me just show you a picture. Oh, I lost my picture. Well, okay, no picture, but you could Google a picture if you wanted to. Okay, there's less of a risk of this now because they actually put iodine in your food. If you go to the grocery store and you pull a thing of table salt down, you'll take a look at it, and you'll see that it says it's iodized, that there's been iodine that's put in it. So interesting little feature there about nutrition. Okay, here's what the histology of the thyroid gland looks like. And there are what are known as follicular cells, and then there are known as what are called the thyroid follicles. So it's a unique tissue. There's these little lakes here, which are called the thyroid follicles. And those are where the T3 and T4 hormones are made. Whereas calcitonin is made somewhere else. It's made in the follicular cells that are around here. There are these cells called the C cells because they look a little bit more clear, and those are the ones that are making calcitonin. So two different mechanisms here for hormone production. Okay, here's how the story shakes out. So you have iodide ions, which are negatively charged in the blood. They get pumped in with a pump that's thyroid stimulating hormone sensitive. So this is one of the main target sites for TSH. The iodide ions get oxidized, meaning they lose their electrons, and then they just become iodine atoms, so no longer aqueous ions. And they get bound to tyrosine. So the way it works is tyrosine gets packaged up into this molecule known as thyroglobulin. This is in the follicular cavity, so you've got some tyrosine here and some tyrosine here, and then you've got tyrosine here and tyrosine there. And this is a nice little meeting place for the iodine atoms to date and court the tyrosine residues. So how it works is the iodine gets pumped in here. It's going to bind to the tyrosine. So you've got tyrosine, 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 tyrosine. And then whether we're talking about T3 or T4, the difference is just how many iodine atoms are on them. So T3 is going to have 3 iodine atoms, and T4 is going to have 4 iodine atoms. Okay, once this whole dance happens here, the thyroglobulin is broken down, and it releases then the tyrosine and other things that can be recycled to start the whole process again. Okay, then once you have the T3 and the T4, these will diffuse into the blood. They generally have to ride on a chaperone. So there's what's known as a thyroid binding globulin that can grab onto them and shuttle them through the blood to the place where they need to go. Okay, regulation of T3 and T4, basically how it works is if the concentration of T3 and T4 are low, then the hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone, which is going to then come down to the anterior pituitary gland, cause it to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone then goes to the thyroid tissue, specifically the follicles, and it triggers T3 and T4 production. Okay, these travel in the blood then to various cells, and some of their effects is that they increase the metabolic rate, and they're going to increase the body temperature. Now, you don't want this to keep happening. If it's increasing the body temperature and increasing the metabolic rate, and it keeps going higher and higher and higher and higher and higher, then that would be a bad thing. You only want it to go higher to the extent that it's required and then shut off. Sort of like think about it like a furnace. If your house gets cold, you want the furnace to turn on and you want it to heat your house, but you don't want it to keep heating your house, otherwise it's going to be way too hot. So there always has to be a negative feedback then to kill the on switch. And what happens here is that if there's elevated T3 and T4 levels, they will then inhibit the release of thyroid releasing hormone, and then that should stop the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. And then there's no T3 and T4 made again. So this is a really classic feedback pathway to show how these hormones are regulated. Okay, right on the other side of the parathyroid gland then is the parathyroid, or sorry, right on the other side of the thyroid gland is the parathyroid gland, or glands. There's 4 of them, and para means they're around the thyroid gland. And these will make parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone does the opposite of calcitonin. Parathyroid hormone will raise a low blood calcium level. So calcitonin released by the thyroid gland, specifically the C cells, will lower a high calcium. Parathyroid hormone released in the parathyroid glands will raise a low blood calcium. Its mechanism of action is something like the following here. So if blood calcium levels drop, so you have a low blood calcium, then the cells in the parathyroid gland will make parathyroid hormone. It will travel into the blood, and here's what it does to try and raise the calcium. Okay, it's going to inhibit the osteoblasts, and what that means is that the osteoblasts are the cells that are making bone. The osteoblasts would take calcium out of the blood and put it onto the bone. And so if you inhibit the osteoblasts, the bone-making cells, they're not taking as much calcium out of the blood anymore. So it would spare or save the level of calcium. On the flip side, it would stimulate the osteoclasts. These are the bone breaking down cells, so they would start to break down the bone and release the calcium. They break down the bone and release the calcium, and that calcium would then travel into the blood. Okay, on the flip side, let's see, parathyroid hormone also works in the kidneys, and what it's going to do is it's going to cause the kidneys to recover more calcium, so it's not being excreted in the urine. And then an additional thing is that it causes the release of calcitriol. So calcitriol is one of the final pathways for like vitamin D. Actually, if you know about the skin and how your sun has to land on the skin to make vitamin D, well, vitamin D eventually gets converted into calcitriol, and calcitriol is like parathyroid hormone's sidekick. It helps to reclaim calcium, but specifically its target site is different. Parathyroid hormone has the target sites of the bone cells and then also the kidney. Calcitriol, its site of action is on the intestines, and what it does is it encourages more absorption of calcium from the food across the intestinal cells of the epithelial tissues in the small intestine. So you're going to be pulling more and more calcium in from your food that you eat. So with all these things, breaking down the bone to release calcium, stopping the bone cells from taking calcium out of the blood, reabsorbing more calcium out of the filtrate in the nephron, the filtrate in the urinary system, and then also absorbing more into your food. All of those three are going to help you to raise the blood calcium. And calcium is really important. It has a pretty narrow range. I think it's like 8.5 to 11. I think, what is that, milligrams per deciliter or something. And one of the most important roles for it is that there's a lot of calcium signaling that happens to make your neurons work. There's a large influx of calcium that happens to cause the release of neurotransmitters. Calcium is required for the contraction of your skeletal muscle and your cardiac muscle, and as well as your smooth muscles. So a lot of important function there, and it depends on a specific concentration of calcium. So if it's too high or too low, it can really start to mess things up. In fact, I always tell the story. I had a friend in college who played one of the lead roles in The Crucible, and it was Act 2, and we were coming back to the scene, and he was getting ready to do his thing, and he just froze. He just couldn't move. He was stuck in a way, and they actually had to come take him off and bring him to the hospital. And I guess there was something wrong with his calcium levels. So, important enough where it could render you completely like frozen and unable to move if the calcium levels get out of an imbalance. Okay, oh, there's my picture of a goiter that I was looking for. So we found it. Okay, keep coming down here. The adrenal glands are next. These have two portions to them. There's the cortex, and then there's also the medulla, the middle part. Okay, there are different hormones made in these different spots. So, for example, the adrenal medulla is going to make the hormones that we classically think of when we think of the adrenal gland, and those are epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline. Okay. The cortex, though, has a whole assortment of things that are made here, and there's different things made in each layer. So there's three specific layers. There's the zona glomerulosa, zona vesiculata, and the zona reticularis. And the hormones that are made in these areas are the following. The outermost superficial parts of the adrenal cortex are where the mineralocorticoids are made, of which one of the prime examples is aldosterone. Aldosterone, its main effect is to help you retain salt. It does this specifically in the urinary system. There are pumps that are sodium-potassium pumps that are aldosterone sensitive. So when aldosterone binds to those pumps, it causes more calcium to be pumped out of the filtrate, and then it will accumulate into the blood and into the interstitium. And that's important because it allows water to follow. Water generally follows salt. The higher the osmolarity of something, the more the draw is for water to go there. And so if you need more water to stay, then you just reclaim the salt and the water will follow it, and it won't be lost in the urine. The glucocorticoids are made in the next layer down, and the examples here are cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. And these can be released in times of stress, so they're thought to be stress hormones, and the term that is sometimes used to describe them is that they have what's known as a glucose-sparing effect. So they will cause you to stop building secondary tissues or tissues that aren't totally essential, so that you can accumulate nutrients. And they will cause glucose they will ensure that there's a steady supply of glucose on hand. So maybe glycogen would be broken down to make sure glucose is on hand, and amino acids and proteins and things broken down in times of stress, because you don't really want to have your body working on stuff it doesn't need to. You want to make sure that there's plenty of the raw essential nutrients to just keep you alive. So that's the sort of the thought there. Now there's an additional effect of these. They are anti-inflammatory. So for example, like cortisone injections you might have heard of, where they take a needle and they put it in your knee or they put it in your back, in your vertebrae, and they'll inject some cortisone, and that's thought to lower the inflammation. Or on the flip side of that, there is hydrocortisone, and that's a really common. If you go to like Walgreens or something, you'll see on any anti-itch, any topical agent or anti-itch type agent, usually the predominant drug is hydrocortisone. Okay, the androgens, these are going to help to stimulate the production of estrogen and testosterone. And then we have epinephrine and norepinephrine, which do a whole host of things that can either increase your heart rate or dilate your vessels or constrict your vessels, so on and so forth. All right, the pancreas is going to look something like this. And recall that much of it is a digestive organ, but scattered throughout the digestive organ are these little pancreatic islets, okay? And the pancreatic islets have alpha cells and they have beta cells. The alpha cells will be making glucagon and the beta cells will be making insulin. Glucagon and insulin have different jobs. Glucagon lowers, that's opposite. Glucagon raises a low blood sugar, and insulin lowers a high blood sugar. So one brings the blood sugar up, the other one brings the blood sugar down. Okay, the pineal gland is an important gland that's in your brain. So this would be on the posterior margins of the diencephalon. And it is going to be a place where melatonin is made. Melatonin is thought to set your circadian rhythm, your sleep and your wake cycles. The cells that make this are somewhat governed by light. There's receptors in the retina that come back and affect the production of melatonin. So, for example, when there are conditions of light, it's bright out, it's daylight, melatonin production is inhibited, and so you feel a sense of wakefulness. Once it gets dark, then melatonin is made. And that will help to make you start feeling sleepy. There's a whole bunch of other trippy stuff too with the pineal gland. Like it's thought it makes this stuff called DMT, and when you die, there's a big rush of DMT that passes through your brain. And people that take DMT, they call it the God drug because it's like it brings them into the celestial realms or something. I've never done it, nor do I know anything about it, but I've heard some interesting tales from DMT. But that, I think, is thought to come from the pineal gland as well. Okay, that's going to wrap us up for our survey of endocrine organs and the hormones that they make.